The Economist magazine called it like the most disruptive act in the history of trade policy.
Tariffs are a personal obsession of Donald Trump, something that he's been going on about for 40 years. That's clearly his own personal baggage.
It is just infuriating, isn't it? It's empty homes, it's we need more council housing, it's we need rent controls. I mean, the answer to all of these questions is very simple.
Why can a theme park not just be a theme park? Why is that not good enough? Why does it also at the same time have to bail out the steel industry?
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price, Director of Communications here, and as always, I am joined today by our Executive Director, Tom Clougherty, and our Editorial Director, Kristian Niemietz. Now, tariffs is the story of the day, the story of the week once again, I'm afraid. So there will be plenty of talk on that, but we'll also be chatting about steel and about what Westminster Council is trying to get up to. But before then, to see and hear more from the IEA, do follow us on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk, where you can get all of our content, our blogs, our publications and podcasts straight to your inbox. Now, without further ado, Trump, tariffs, the crisis rolls on. We talked about it last week. We spoke about it almost every week this year at this point. But the latest development is that he's after announcing his long sandwich board of random tariffs that we analysed a bit last week, has said there's going to be a 90-day pause on those, other than above the 10% base rate, and not including China, obviously. What do we make of this, Kristian? What is the significance of the 90-day pause? Do we have hope that he's seen the light, or is something else at play here?
Well, who knows? That's the whole problem. It's all totally arbitrary right now. And that's the worst aspect maybe about these tariffs. So I guess we've all tried to avoid saying, here's why tariffs are bad on this podcast, because it's just obvious that we as free marketeers think that tariffs are bad. Nobody would tune in to listen to that. But it's even so, there are second best solutions and third best solutions if you can't have completely free trade. And this is just as far away from that as you can possibly get. So if you must have tariffs, at least make them in a way predictable and steady, so that you don't get this constant what we have now. So traditionally, one of the problems with tariffs with protectionist economies has been that they lead to lobbying efforts. If every industry has its own tariff rate, every sector of the economy has its own tariff rate, what you get is industry groups are organizing in such a way that they try to influence government policy. They try to get their own tariff rate. And rather than thinking, what do consumers want, they start thinking, what does the government want to hear, and organize their activities in that way. And here we are quite clearly getting a situation like that, or maybe something even worse, where each industry's tariff rate will somehow depend on their standing with the president, where it is literally one man who decides these things on a whim. And there was an interesting article on CapEx by Dalibor Rohak, who said, in a way, Trump's America is starting to resemble Putin's Russia, because that was the whole model of Putinism, where oligarchs, their economic fortunes depend on proximity to the president, and where on a whim he can strip an oligarch of their richness, and you just create a patronage economy where everything is geared towards trying to be in the good books of whoever is in power. Now, when I first heard this concept of reciprocal tariffs, when he came up with this a few weeks ago, without announcing any specifics, before we saw the formula and all that, I thought, well, this could be less bad than expected. I knew that it was going to be bad, because it was clear that it was going to mean an increase in the average tariff rate. And an increase in the average tariff rate is obviously a bad thing from a pro-free trade perspective. But I thought, well, if it literally means you look at the tariff rates of other countries and try to model maybe non-tariff barriers, at least that means you have little discretion over it. You just observe what others are doing and you respond to it. Now, I don't believe in, for reasons that we've outlined here many times. I don't believe in reciprocal tariffs. I think it's even the wrong way to think about it. It's completely the wrong model. Or similarly, retaliatory tariffs. Don't believe in the whole concept of it. But the one good thing about it, if you set your tariff rates in such a way that you just respond to what others are doing, you give yourself little room for maneuver. It's the tariff rate would effectively be determined somewhere else, and you just take that out of your hands. What's now happening is the exact opposite, because they're not, even though they call them that, they're not reciprocal. There's nothing reciprocal in the tariffs. It is really just, it seems to depend on whatever Donald Trump's mood is at the moment, and that's I'd say even if I supported tariffs, I think I'd still strongly oppose this version of them.
Yeah, I mean, I thought Dalibor's CapEx piece was really interesting, actually, and it was an angle on this whole story that was kind of fresh. I mean, it's rooted in public choice theory, public choice economics, and the idea of corporate rent seeking and stuff. I think the comparison with Putin's Russia is a little bit overblown, maybe for effect. It certainly gets eyeballs on the piece, but I think this larger point that the tariffs, at least the way they were going before this pullback earlier in the week, was fundamentally kind of changing the relationship between government and business and creating, as you say, that system of sort of patronage. And I think, one of the concerns that Dalibor expressed in that piece was that although the businesses maybe oppose the tariffs in the first place, once they're in and once they get stuck into the lobbying and the rent seeking and they adapt to it, often they become quite sticky because you build up these special interests who benefit from the tariffs, even if overall everybody is losing out massively. And that's why these bad policies tend to persist over time. So, I mean, look, the decision earlier in the week to do a 90-day pause and sort of do a 10% universal tariff, although it's not really a universal 10% because all of the tariffs he'd announced previously are still there. This is just something extra. And of course, there's a very high tariff rate on China as well. It's better than it was. It's still a disaster. And I think it's important to keep this in context, right? The effective tariff rate is still going up by like 15 to 20 percentage points. I think The Economist magazine called it like the most disruptive act in the history of trade policy, even where it stands now without going any further. So it's still a big deal. And I think there's a couple of other interesting angles here as well, maybe, that we can talk about. So one is the extent to which Trump's approach to tariffs is just this thing. It's, he's being very capricious. He's always had this attachment to tariffs. He kind of just lost the concept of them. And it's all a little bit random. And that's one view. The other view is that it's part of a very coherent, bad but coherent economic agenda, which is about kind of trying to reduce the value of the dollar, try and affect America's status as a reserve currency and stuff. And that actually connects with the whole view of foreign policy as well, actually. I mean, so I think to outline it in very basic terms, and our colleague Steve Davies had a piece in The Telegraph talking about this earlier in the week, but the idea, I think, for some in the Trump administration is that being the global reserve currency is kind of costing America, and the rest of the world is free riding on that great service that America is offering, and they need to pay America back. So tariffs is one way to do it. They could just do it by buying more American goods or investing in America and stuff. But I mean, this is nonsense. But nevertheless, there is, or there has been articulated, this kind of coherent view of tariffs and the way they fit into a much broader agenda about reindustrialization and so on. Personally, I don't really see that with Trump himself. No doubt there are people in the administration who are thinking about things in those much grander and more ideological terms. To me, he's still very much a kind of mixed bag politician. So there will be bits of his agenda that look kind of very classically Republican, maybe on tax cuts and deregulation. There's stuff on trade where he's absolutely terrible, but he's kind of had these views for decades and he's probably not going to change them. But in a way, that does have important implications, because if this is part of a coherent project and there is a longer term plan, then you think, well, this 90-day respite is going to be just that. We're going to be back where we started before long. Or if it is much more kind of random and posturing and everything else, well, maybe that points in a different direction for how this shakes out.
Kristian, what do you think the 90-day pause in of itself tells us about that? If it is a sort of a coherent mission, surely the 90-day pause should be criticised by people who true believers in the mission. So do you think that undermines the case that this is part of a sort of coherent economic nationalism, or do you think it's something else entirely?
Well, if it were entirely coherent, you wouldn't do the pause. You would just say, well, this is the right thing to do, and we'll just plow on with it. And if there's some adverse reactions in the market, so be it. So the fact that there has been from his own support base no backlash against him for pausing the tariffs suggests that this isn't really that essential to the Trumpian project. So tariffs are a personal obsession of Donald Trump, something that he's been going on about for 40 years. That's clearly his own personal baggage, something that he carried with him since well before he became a political figure. But Trumpism as a political phenomenon, as a political electoral coalition, I think you could imagine a version of that without protectionism. You could imagine a version of that is purely a culture war phenomenon. And I think Trump Mark I was basically that. And we see this also in the surveys from the time that Trump voters were asked, why did you vote the way you did? And economic concerns were very low. So very few people voted Trump specifically because they thought he was going to make them rich, or he was going to do anything economically that they'd approve of. It was more a backlash against progressivism, against progressive intellectual dominance, and a way of owning the libs, as it's become known. And you can have all that without firm views on economics. And I'd say our own, to the extent that there is a British version of that, it is fairly a-economical. It's mostly people who don't really care that much about economics. And you could imagine a version of Trumpism which is very much like that. If he had a support base that was absolutely adamant on the economic nationalism, and for which this is non-negotiable, you would now get people accusing him of being a traitor because even though, yes, he calls it a pause, but there is, of course, a strong possibility that after the pause, he will not go back to where we were a couple of days ago, that this does signal some kind of climb down at least halfway. And that hasn't happened. There is no Trump supporter who says, okay, the tariffs were brilliant, and now you've U-turned on the tariffs. Now I'm no longer a Trump supporter. Now I'm falling out with that lot. That doesn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, it did a couple of interesting things, right? One, I think, is Elon Musk saying some very disparaging things about Trump's trade advisor, I think calling him as dumb as a bag of rocks or something. I mean, that's funny in and of itself, but it also speaks to, I think, maybe a division between different elements of the MAGA coalition, the ones who are maybe the hardcore economic nationalists, and then the ones who are basically more traditionally free market, but also with the heavy dose of culture war in there as well. The other thing, though, is just wondering what actually precipitated the climb down and the 90-day pause, because the dollar falling didn't seem to be a problem. Equities going down massively didn't seem to be a problem. It looks like, although I don't think there's confirmation of this, that it was when the trouble started in the bond market that maybe they got a little bit of cold feet. And there are, dare I say it, some interesting echoes of Liz Truss and the leveraged LDI issue that succeeded the mini budget in there. So, I mean, in very basic terms, I think what was potentially happening, according to some of the financial press, is you were getting a bond selling doom loop, effectively. So because bond prices were falling, some of the hedge funds were having to make margin calls to the banks. They were having to sell bonds to make those margin calls. So the bond prices were going even lower, causing more margin calls, more bond sales, etc. And these kind of dynamics obviously can just take on a life of their own and spiral and spiral and spiral until you either everything crashes or you need some kind of central bank intervention. So if that's the reason for the pause, I wonder what might be going on behind the scenes. If they're really committed to the tariff policy, will they be trying to influence the hedge funds and have these kind of positions unwound in a more orderly basis before they try again? I mean, I also think, right, if I was Chancellor of the Exchequer or something, it is things like this that would keep me up at night. And I'd be absolutely terrified of these very arcane things that as an economic policymaker, you're probably not even aware of. And suddenly it bursts into light. And look, I'm glad, in a way, that this is happening and that stopped the tariff policy being as severe as it could have been, at least for a while. But it does, I think, speak to some fragility in our financial system, which is very worrying, actually. And I'm not sure that it's a natural product of a free market in operation. I mean, the fact that often these things involve government bonds probably is a sign that it isn't really a free market phenomenon anyway. But there is always, I think, this danger that when you get financial panics, it reflects badly on capitalism and on free markets as a whole. And so that's just something that I would keep an eye on.
One more point on the 90 days window. One problem with it is that, okay, this is framed as a pause for negotiation. And the idea being that if the trade partners reform their trade policy in a way that Trump would like to see, then the tariffs are not coming back. It's just not clear what they can realistically do. What can the EU, for example, do realistically? If you look at the formula, we've said this before at the last podcast. It's not true at all that these tariffs were a response to other countries' tariffs. It's not true that they were a response to other countries' non-tariff barriers. He just says that, but none of that is even in the formula. And he just assumes that if there is a trade deficit, there must be barriers, because otherwise there can be no other reason why people wouldn't want to buy American goods, where, of course, there can be very good reasons. And that means there is nothing that the EU or other economies can realistically do, because Trump's problem was never with specific policies of any of his trading partners. It's just the deficit per se.
Yeah.
And if that's the position, if he's accusing them of something that they're not really doing, what are they supposed to do?
Effectively, I'll take the tariffs away if you stop selling us stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. So on that, I'd like to zoom out a little bit. Andrew Lillico, our economics fellow here at the Institute of Economic Affairs, wrote a piece for us on Insider in defence of trade deficits, where he basically explained what a trade deficit was, how it worked, and why maybe we shouldn't worry about it that much. Kristian, could you take a step back and run us through what he argued?
Yeah, more broadly, I'd say there is a problem with the term trade deficit, because it makes it sound as if you were depleting something, as if you were running something down. So if you have deficits in your personal finances, you're spending more than you earn, then you're running down your savings or running into debt. And that is obviously unsustainable. Trade deficits, well, it makes it sound as if something similar was going on when it isn't really. So if you want to buy foreign goods, you need foreign currency, and you can get that in two ways. You can export and sell stuff, and then you get foreign currency in that way. But if you have a trade deficit, then that clearly isn't happening to a sufficient degree. That means export don't give you enough foreign currency to buy all your imports, and then where does it come from? Can only really come from inward investment, from foreign direct investment. You have lots of foreigners who want to invest in your country, more than there are nationals who want to invest abroad, and that is how you finance the trade deficit. So because otherwise, say if nobody wanted to invest in Britain or in America or whatever the economy is, if nobody wanted to invest here, then we just couldn't run a trade deficit, because how would we pay for all those imports that we're getting above the exports? We need to get the foreign currency somehow. It has to come into the country somehow. Otherwise, it just becomes a trade deficit would just become self-limiting. At some point, you would just run out of foreign currency, and then you couldn't buy in the foreign goods that you want to have. And normally, when we have foreign direct investment coming in that exceeds outward investment, we would consider that a good thing. But that is just a mirror image of the trade deficit. And from that perspective, a trade deficit doesn't have to be a problem.
Yeah. And floating exchange rates play an important balancing role in this as well. And I often think, actually, when people talk about trade deficits, they're often stuck in a mindset that probably predates the end of Bretton Woods in 1972, or even goes back to the gold standard. And people have this idea that the vaults of gold under the Bank of England are being drained. And once we've run out of gold, we're not going to be able to buy anything anymore or something. It's just not the way that modern economies work. So, yeah, I mean, I think that the whole rhetoric about trade deficits, you're right, Kristian, we should come up with a better term for it, because there are basically two sides of the ledger and they balance. It's not a big deal.
Indeed, which is a good place to move on away from trade for just a short while, if you'll allow us. This week, Westminster City Council, from the global to the very, very local, has called on the government to give it powers to seize properties that have been left empty for longer than 6 months. They claim that they've got 11,000 empty properties in Westminster Council, and there's a housing crisis on, don't you know? So the government should be able to give the council the power to go and basically occupy and take control of these properties. Kristian, this is the solution to the housing crisis now.
Yeah, well, it's one of those ideas that come up every now and then, and it just refuses to go away, and it's very annoying because it's a total non-issue. So the fact that they express the number of empty properties in absolute terms already tells you something, that there's something dodgy going on there. You should express them as a proportion of the housing stock. Because otherwise you're not going to know how many houses are there in Westminster. 11,000. How much is that? Is that a lot? Is that very little? The answer is it's very little. Britain in general has an extremely low vacancy rate. So it's one of the lowest in the OECD. I think there are 2 or 3 places where it's a little bit less, but it's less than 1% of the housing stock that is empty for prolonged periods. So vacancy really not an issue, and for completely unsurprising reasons. It's precisely because of the fact that housing is so expensive here. That means leaving a house empty has a high opportunity cost, and that is a reason for not doing it, which is why very few people do it. Now, if you look for it, I'm sure you can find an example, and Westminster City Council has done that. They found one example of a Qatari oil gazillionaire, whatever, who bought a flat here. Ones probably forgot about it, because for them this is small coins, so this is nothing. But as a proportion of the housing stock, that's basically nothing, rounding error, and it should be. So if it is in the order of magnitude of a percent of the housing stock or less, then that is really the kind of growth rate of the housing stock that we should be looking at on an annual basis. So ideally, the housing stock should grow by that rate or more every year. And that was historically true. In the Victorian age, the housing stock used to grow by between 1% and 2% every year. And then we would see that number of properties as just the amount that we add anyway in a given year, and it wouldn't be a big deal. So this is really not worth undermining property rights for, because that's the downside, obviously, of this. That once you start, and they didn't say how exactly they want to do it, but once you start undermining property rights, you are really undermining one of the things that make London in particular, Britain in general, but especially London, an attractive place to invest in. And it has had this reputation for a long time, that this is a place where property rights and the rule of law can be seen as guaranteed. You may not make a fantastic return, but it's a safe haven, a safe bet. And once you lose that reputation, you're not going to get it back easily. And the other thing here is, it's a bit like with the wealth tax. I think we said this on either last time or the week before, that this is an idea which is based in zero-sum thinking, where as long as we live in a stagnant economy, as long as we have, say, either the economy as a whole being stagnant or the housing stock, or if we're talking about a fixed pie, as long as the pie really does look fixed because there isn't enough growth, we get obsessed with what other people are doing with their slice of the pie. Whether somebody maybe gets a bigger slice than they need, and I'd say if we had other sectors of the economy organized in the way we organize housing. So imagine we had a cap on cars. So a Trumpian tariff, say, on car imports combined with a domestic production cap or whatever. Then over time, cars would become a luxury good. And if we had a situation like that, people would get obsessed with the neighbor who doesn't drive their car very often. And
cheaper cars or
Yes, exactly. Yes, you would get initiatives campaigning against second car ownership, and you would have equivalents of, there are Twitter accounts, there are people who go around and take pictures of buildings in the evening and then and point at windows where the light isn't on, and then they say, oh, look, empty. Where if we just had enough housing, nobody would care if somebody is maybe not at home all the time, but maybe they're just empty because the other people are walking around somewhere else, also taking photos of housing blocks. But yeah, you get into this mindset where it's the shortage mindset, the rationing mindset. There isn't enough of something, so you get obsessed with, my neighbor has a bit more than they need. My neighbor isn't using their resource. My neighbor hasn't been driving their car for 6 weeks. I can see the dust gathering on it. And if we organized any other sector of the economy in that way, then we would get the same debates. Then you would get the same social media accounts photographing cars, probably.
I mean, it is just infuriating, isn't it? It's empty homes. We need more council housing. We need rent controls. I mean, the answer to all of these questions is very simple. Just let the private sector build the housing that there is massive demand for. In Westminster of all places, right? And we don't have to overcomplicate this. And it just astonishes me the degree to which people are bending over backwards to mount these often very silly economic or uneconomic arguments when the solution is staring all of us right in the face. But, there you go. It's this sort of zero-sum mindset, actually. It's like, no more development. Let's just redistribute what we've got more fairly. Completely wrong way to look at these things.
And the overall problem is, for people like us especially, but for people who believe in growth as being a general benefit, is that, as it comes back to what a point you referenced in the trade discussion as well, that people basically become very sceptical of capitalism and of what it's doing for them because the pie hasn't grown at all. Whereas we would point to the past 14 years of no growth and nobody being able to get on the housing ladder as a very much not a functioning capitalist market.
Yeah.
And everyone else is going, not everyone else, but lots of other people suddenly say, well, the system clearly isn't working, so capitalism must be turned on its head.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the problems. Support for capitalism is always extremely unstable. So even in good times, and as soon as we don't have good times, anti-capitalist sentiments immediately come back. So even at the time when it seems that people are reasonably accepting of the market economy, that's always tentative, always unstable. You just need the economy or some sector in it getting a bit wobbly, and you immediately get an anti-capitalist backlash. So that's why the anti-capitalists are always in a much easier position than we are, because anti-capitalism just makes more intuitive sense. We are instinctively just anti-capitalists, and that's why we have the problem. We are telling people to basically not listen to their knee-jerk impulses, knee-jerk reactions to something, but to think things through properly. Whereas the anti-capitalist side can just tell their audience, your knee-jerk reaction to that problem, it's exactly right. Double down on it.
I mean, maybe if we're talking about America launching a trade war and tariffs, maybe we should, maybe the government should look at another time this happened and draw some inspiration in the 1930s with the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which, of course, are famous, probably the most famous tariffs in history, not as significant as what Trump is talking about. Now, there was no connection between that and Britain having a massive building boom, but that was the last time that we really had private sector house building at a massive rate, and we want to have that again. And I think it can happen if the government just gets out of the way and liberalises the planning system.
Indeed. So from that into a fine example of the joys that capitalism can bring, the first universal theme park in Europe is going to be built in Bedford, thanks to the government approving it. Thank you very much for that. But so this is going to be built. It's going to start being built in the next few years. It'll take a while to build, but it's a vast project, which will involve infrastructure as well as the theme park itself. and is said to be bringing billions into the economy through tourism by 2050. All these sort of government press release numbers. But one of the debates spinning out of it has obviously been about steel. So the exam question I set to you both is, should the new Universal theme park be built exclusively using British steel? Tom?
No. I mean, if it makes commercial sense for them to buy and use British steel, then I'm all for that. But we shouldn't be in a position to tell these businesses what to do. Let them pick their own inputs and everything else. I know the broader question that you're getting at now, because they got the British steel plant in Scunthorpe, I think. Its Chinese owners are shutting it down. This has obviously triggered a bit of panic. Reform have said that they will nationalise maybe that plant, maybe the whole steel industry, I'm not sure. So basically this idea is rearing its head again. And we were talking about it in the research office yesterday, weren't we, that steel is being nationalised and then denationalised and then nationalised again. And, it's a long story, right? But I think there are a few things to consider here. First of all, why is steel making seemingly so uncompetitive in Britain? Now, I'm sure that energy costs play a part. I'm sure that planning constraints play a part. There was a famous story where they fitted a new blast furnace at Port Talbot Steelworks, and they had a massive increase in their business rates bill as a result. So there may be all of these factors which are constraining the steel industry in the UK, and possibly if you fixed them, then it would be more competitive, and maybe it would be able to survive without government support. I think it's quite plausible that it wouldn't be able to survive without some sort of government support. But then I think that raises the second question. If these guys, a commercial outfit, are losing, I think, £700,000 a day keeping this steelworks open, do you really want to spend taxpayers' money on that? Do you think the government is actually going to be able to run it profitably? I doubt it. If not, in a situation where we're fiscally constrained, people are feeling the pinch, do we want to throw good money after bad, essentially? I would argue not. So this case doesn't add up to me. I don't buy the communitarian industrial strategy case for a government role in steel. Now, there is an argument, I suppose, about supply chain security, about the defence industry, and so on. And so some people, defence hawks, will say, well, you absolutely need a sovereign steel capacity to be sort of a big world power and stuff. Now, as I understand it, we don't actually use a lot of British steel in our defence products, or indeed we just use a lot of imported stuff, often quite specialised steel. But also, look, we import the iron ore, we import the coking coal. There are other European countries that have much more significant steel output than we do. It seems to me to be a seductive but false argument that we absolutely have to have a domestic steel industry. I want to be clear, I'm not against it. I'd love to fix all those supply side problems and have an industry that flourished. But this does seem to me just kind of a romantic, antiquated thinking to say we must have a steelworks or we're not a proper country.
It's also another example of everythingism. Every good thing must be connected with every other desirable thing. So why can a theme park not just be a theme park? Why is that not good enough? Why does it also at the same time have to bail out the steel industry? Just let it do whatever it's going to be about entertainment, and that's good enough. And let it treat the steel sector as something separate from that.
And you can see how this starts to unravel, right? The government makes some pledge to build 95% of this theme park with British steel, which raises the cost of it, which potentially puts off the investment of all, then you end up in a world where there's no growth. You end up with this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that is one of the problem. I mean, the government just tries to squeeze developers as much as possible, and I think actually that probably makes quite a lot of development unviable in sort of lower cost parts of the country. So no, I mean it's that classic thing, isn't it? The guy who was asked, why do you rob banks? And he said, well, that's where the money is. And this is just the way government goes about anything. Well, look, here's a project. How many different political objectives can we load onto it? How much tax can we extract from it? But this is just not the way that government should work at all. Government should be there to create a framework of laws that allows markets to flourish and allows people to kind of pursue their own self-interest and allows, companies to be motivated by profits to satisfy consumer demand. I mean, all those things are present in spades here. We don't have to make it about steel. I mean, it's about Harry Potter. It's probably really about Harry Potter, I think. But
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today, but thank you for tuning in. Follow us on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk to keep up to date with everything that we've got going on, and tune in next time. Until then, thank you very much.